elderly man denied access to funds. Walter Thompson, a 71-year-old man with the weight of decades of hard work and loyalty in his steps, entered the First Savings Bank with a single, pressing need: access to his own money. For over 40 years, Walter had been a dedicated customer, and his bank account was more than just a number. It was a testament to a life spent saving for his future, a future that now depended on his ability to retrieve his funds in time to save his wife, Margaret. Margaret, his partner in life and love, had just been diagnosed with a severe illness, and the medication she needed to continue her treatment was time-sensitive. $350 worth of life-saving medication she desperately needed by the end of. Walter, despite his age and frailty, had always prided himself on being a man of dignity, one who had never asked for a handout. Yet, today, his attempts to withdraw funds were met with cold indifference and robotic precision. The teller, young and unfamiliar with Walter's history, repeated the same harsh mantra: "Without the updated digital verification, we cannot access your account." Walter's hands, worn from a lifetime of hard labor and the years of coaching youth sports, trembled slightly as he attempted to explain his situation. He fumbled with old identification papers and veterans' cards, but they were dismissed by the system. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't make exceptions. Please step aside," the bank staff insisted, their voices rising in an uncomfortable mix of protocol and impatience. As Walter was escorted out of the bank, each step he took seemed to echo the weight of the years he had spent trusting this institution, only to have his dignity stripped away in the blink of an eye. He was more than just a customer to this bank. He was part of a community, a man who had served his country, raised children, and helped countless others. But none of that mattered in the face of modern technology. The digital age had no place for the elderly, it seemed, and today, Walter was learning that lesson the hard way. New bank policies. The digital divide. The world had changed, and Walter Thompson was left struggling to keep up. What had once been a simple process, withdrawal of his hard-earned pension, had now become an insurmountable challenge, a testament to the growing divide between old-world values and the relentless march of technology. The bank, which had once been a trusted institution, now seemed like an unfeeling fortress, built upon rules and policies that left little room for empathy or understanding. Rebecca Stevens, the young bank manager, had no choice but to uphold the new digital verification protocols, which had been put in place to protect the bank and its customers from fraud. These policies were part of the merger with National Financial Group, and as a rising star in the corporate world, Rebecca's career was tied to enforcing these rules, no matter the cost. As she sat behind her sleek, glass-walled desk typing furiously on her computer, Rebecca maintained a professional composure, her fingers dancing over the keyboard with practiced precision. She understood the importance of these measures. Two-factor authentication, biometric scanning, and mandatory smartphone app registration were the modern safeguards meant to protect people like Walter from fraud. But there was one glaring problem. Walter didn't have a smartphone. His world was not one of apps and digital IDs. It was a world of paper, of memories captured in old photographs, and the security of in-person connections. But today, none of that mattered. Rebecca tried to explain, her voice kind but firm. "The system is absolute, Mr. Thompson. Without the proper digital verification, we cannot authenticate your identity. It's for your protection, for everyone's protection." But Walter wasn't asking for protection. He was asking for the chance to access his own savings, to save his wife's life. He had brought every document he could muster. His veteran's ID, utility bills, even old account opening paperwork. But none of it was good enough in this new era of digital banking. The bank, in its quest for security, had built walls that blocked out the very people it was meant to serve. For Rebecca, it was about efficiency, about following the rules, and about doing what was necessary to avoid the risk of fraud. But for Walter, this was about survival. His voice quivered with frustration and sorrow, yet he never raised it. His life, it seemed, no longer had a place in this new world. His decades of loyalty, his decades of savings, were all irrelevant now. A system designed to protect had become a wall that kept him from his own money, from the means to save his wife. The bank's shiny new system was a symbol of progress, But for Walter, it felt like nothing more than a cold, indifferent machine, indifferent to the lives it was supposed to help. Rebecca's sympathetic words did little to ease the sting. She saw the red warning on her screen, the unverified account, the inevitable compliance with corporate mandates. Yet in that moment, she was also aware of the silent, deepening chasm between the bank's policies and the very real human need standing before her. Shaquille O'Neal intervenes, a moment of compassion. Outside the bank, Shaquille O'Neal and his daughter Miara were simply passing by when they saw an elderly man sitting alone on a bench, his shoulders trembling with quiet sobs. The sight was heart-wrenching. An old man, broken not just by the weight of age, but by a system that had failed him in his most desperate moment. Shaq, a towering figure known for his strength and success, seemed to dwarf the scene before him. But it wasn't his physical stature that caught Walter's attention. It was his presence. With a gentle approach, Shaq's deep voice cut through the tension of the moment. "Sir, are you okay?" he asked, his words full of concern, not just for the man but for the larger story unfolding. Walter's voice cracked as he explained his plight. His wife's cancer treatment, the urgent need for medication, and the cold refusal by the bank to release his own money. Shaq listened, his expression softening with each word. Miara, already kneeling beside Walter, helped him collect his scattered papers. Among the documents, she found an old team photo, one that struck a chord. "Dad, this is Coach Thompson," she said, recognizing the man from conversations she'd heard earlier. Walter had been a staple in the community, a coach who had helped kids, who had given everything he had to others. The community had trusted him, and now, in his hour of need, the system that was supposed to serve him had turned its back. Shaq's heart sank. He had lost his own sister to cancer, and the mention of medication and treatment hit him hard. Shaq knew the weight of a deadline, how every minute lost could feel like a lifetime. The frustration Walter felt was something Shaq could relate to deeply. In that moment, Shaq realized it wasn't just about the transaction. It was about dignity, about human connection. It was about doing what was right, even when the system seemed more concerned with policies than with people. He turned to Walter, his voice firm yet comforting. "Coach, let's go back in there together. You've spent your life helping others. It's time someone helped you." It wasn't just about giving Walter his money, it was about standing up for what was right. Shaq knew that when the world had become increasingly impersonal, the smallest acts of compassion could make all the difference. Together, with Miara in tow, Shaq and Walter walked back toward the doors of the bank, where a crowd of curious onlookers had gathered, their phones recording every moment. The message was clear. This wasn't just about money. It was about the humanity behind the transaction. Shaq had become an unexpected hero in this story, not because of his fame or wealth, but because he chose to stand with Walter in the face of a broken system. And in doing so, he reminded everyone that compassion was more powerful than any policy or protocol. Shaq's influence, a force for change. As Shaquille O'Neal walked toward the entrance of the bank with Walter, a heavy silence seemed to follow them, the tension palpable. It wasn't just the sight of an NBA legend accompanying an elderly man that turned heads. It was the weight of the moment. What had begun as a simple act of compassion had evolved into something much larger, a confrontation between human decency and corporate bureaucracy. Inside the bank, Rebecca Stevens, the young manager who had adhered to the bank's rigid policies, froze as she saw Shaq and Walter approaching. Her heart raced. This was no longer a matter of account verification or banking protocols. The power dynamic had shifted. This wasn't just about one man's struggle. It had become a moral reckoning for an institution that had forgotten its roots. Shaq's presence commanded respect, but it wasn't just his stature that made people listen. It was the conviction in his voice. "Miss Stevens," Shaq began, his deep voice carrying across the room with a calm yet firm authority. The bank's staff, who had been previously oblivious to the growing tension, now found themselves on edge, their eyes darting nervously as the scene unfolded. Shaq wasn't just a basketball player, he was a man who understood the true value of community, who had seen how fragile lives could be when institutions failed to acknowledge the human element behind every transaction. "Let me ask you something," Shaq continued, his gaze steady as he addressed Rebecca. How many times have you looked at a policy and wondered if it was truly serving the people it was meant to protect? There was a pause. The room grew quieter. Shaq had spoken not just to Rebecca, but to everyone in the room, customers, staff, onlookers, all of whom were now witness to something far bigger than a single transaction. He wasn't asking for exceptions. He was asking for the bank to remember what it stood for. I sit on the boards of several banks, Shaq said, his voice unwavering. I understand the regulations you're talking about, but I also understand that when we place more value on policies than people, we lose sight of what banking is truly about. It's not just about protecting money, it's about protecting trust. The room seemed to hold its breath. Rebecca's eyes flickered nervously to her screen as Shaq's words settled in. She had been trained to follow the rules, to implement security measures without question. But in that moment, the weight of her role seemed to shift. This wasn't just about following orders. It was about being a steward of the community, a role she had forgotten in her pursuit of corporate success. Shaq's calm but firm stance, his refusal to back down, was a reminder that people's lives were more important than any policy, and, as his voice resonated with authority, it was clear to everyone present that this was no longer about Walter's withdrawal. It was about restoring the human element to an institution that had lost its way. With each word, Shaq was challenging not just the bank's policies, but the very essence of what banking should be, a service to people, not a system of barriers. The old coach's dignity, once stripped away by bureaucracy, was now being restored by a man who understood that sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. Bank reconsiders, a moment of moral reckoning. In the tense stillness that followed Shaq's powerful words, a quiet shift occurred. Rebecca Stevens stood there, tablet in hand, the reality of her position weighing heavily on her. For the first time, the corporate policies she had been so eager to enforce felt distant, as though they no longer represented the institution she had been trained to uphold. The numbers on her screen, the protocols flashing in red, the strict liability clauses from corporate headquarters, all of it seemed irrelevant in the face of Walter's need. In that moment, she was no longer just a manager, she was a human being confronted with the raw, painful truth of what had gone wrong. Jack's unwavering stance, his refusal to let the bank hide behind its policies, had struck a chord. His words weren't just about Walter's transaction, they were about the larger question of what banking, and indeed society, should stand for. Was it about blind adherence to rules, or was it about recognizing the humanity of the people we serve? The eyes of the crowd outside the glass walls, the camera phones now recording, amplified the weight of the decision Rebecca was about to make. As the silence stretched, Rebecca felt a pang of discomfort. She had been the one to uphold the no exceptions rule, the one who had followed orders without hesitation. Yet now, in front of a crowd and with Shaq's words still echoing in her mind, she understood something deeper. A policy that stripped away a person's dignity for the sake of convenience or security was no policy worth keeping. The bank had become a symbol of cold efficiency, a place where technology was placed above human connection, where systems became more important than people. In this moment, she realized that perhaps the true security the bank offered was not in its digital protocols, but in the trust it had built over decades, trust that had been shattered in an instant by a rigid adherence to policy. Rebecca looked up from her tablet, meeting Shaq's steady gaze. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the override button, a decision that felt both momentous and deeply personal. She wasn't just bending the rules, she was acknowledging that sometimes policies should bend to serve people, not the other way around. "Let's process your withdrawal now," Rebecca said, her voice carrying a new weight, a quiet sense of resolution. "I'll take full responsibility for this." The tension in the room dissipated slightly, but the impact of the moment remained. Shaq's influence had done more than change the course of Walter's day. It had caused Rebecca to confront the true purpose of her job, to serve people, not systems. And in that moment, the balance between technology and humanity was restored, if only for a brief moment. For Walter, it was a victory, a moment where his dignity was reclaimed, But for the bank, it was a reminder of the cost of losing sight of the human element in the pursuit of progress. Humanity prevails, restoring dignity. As Walter Thompson's funds were processed and handed back to him, the weight of the moment felt almost overwhelming. The years of loyalty, the decades of hard work, and the pain of being rejected by the very system that was supposed to serve him, all of it began to fade into a small victory. He stood there, trembling slightly, his hand still grasping the bank envelope, but now with a glimmer of dignity restored. The same man who had been thrown out of the bank just hours earlier now held in his hands what he needed most, the means to save his wife's life. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the respect he had been denied. A respect that Shaquille O'Neal had reminded everyone in that room was owed to him. Shaq's influence had been undeniable. His simple, powerful words, grounded in experience, empathy, and an unwavering sense of justice, had shifted the course of Walter's day. But more importantly, Shaq's actions had brought a deeper reflection to everyone present. It wasn't enough for institutions to simply be efficient, they had to be humane. They had to remember that, at the core, they were built to serve people, not just policies or procedures. And Shaq had reminded them of that fact in the most profound way possible. As Walter turned to leave, he offered a heartfelt thank you to Shaq, but the NBA legend wasn't done. With a smile, Shaq reached for his wallet and handed Walter a few bills. "Consider this an investment in the legacy of your skyhook," Shaq joked, referring to the famous basketball move that had once given him legendary status on the court. But beyond the humor, there was a deeper meaning. A message that true victory isn't always achieved with slam dunks or championships. Sometimes, the greatest victories are won through simple acts of human dignity. Before they left, Miara, Shaq's daughter, turned to the camera, her voice filled with the passion of youth. "What happened today wasn't just about a bank transaction," she said. "It was about standing up for what's right, no matter the odds." And with that, the message was clear. We all have a responsibility to protect the dignity of those around us, to challenge systems when they fail to serve the people, and to never let technology overshadow human connection. If you believe in standing up for what's right, in protecting human dignity, and in the power of compassion, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know how you would have reacted if you were in Walter's shoes, or how you think banks and corporations can better serve their communities. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more incredible stories of everyday heroes. Together we can make the world a little more compassionate, one act at a time.